Okay, so today, so I believe next week we have, wait, what is next week?
Spring break.
Oh, it's spring break, okay. So, we have no brown bag next week. We also have no brown bag the week after because that's the kind of PAA time. So this is our second in our pre-PAA presentations. No postdoctoral individuals volunteered for either week, but we have a few more students. So thank you for volunteering or being what the sailors done, roped into it. That's not true. What happens to sailors when they're
Shanghai.
Shanghai. So we're going to start with Haley, who is giving a presentation that is what she's going to do at PAA. She's doing a regular paper presentation. So if you can't read a slide, if you have any things about the presentation, that would be very useful for her. And then we will have two poster presentations in order to be negotiated after that. Okay, so Haley, take it away.
All right. Okay, so my name is Haley Pierce, and I'm in the second year of the Demography program. And as a bit of a spoiler alert, my plan here is to take the existing literature that has come out through the process of the Millennium Development Goals, to look at reductions in infant mortality, and my plan is to find where our priorities should lie following the Millennium Development Goals, seeing as they ended in 2015. So my plan is to kind of set some priorities to where we should go next. To recap, goal number 4 is what I'm focusing on. It was established by the UN in 2000, and their aim was to reduce child mortality under 5 from the 1990 level to 2015 by 2/3. And so progress has been made overall at the aggregate level by about 50%, which is a pretty significant amount. But when you look at regions and different countries, you can see that the efforts to reduce child mortality and the successes have varied quite greatly. Just kind of as an overall, you can see where the target has been reached in most countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Eastern Europe. Where you see a lot of the deficiencies are in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And I mean, the point to take from this is that success is possible even in poorer regions. And so now that 2015 has come and gone, the point is to continue with these efforts. There is progress, but there's still a lot of room to be made. My paper focuses on neonatal and infant mortality because it is a very vast proportion of under 5 mortality. Over 50% of deaths take place in the first month of life and 75% in the first year. So in order to reduce under 5 mortality, we have to target these periods. Substantial reductions have to be made in this first month and first year in order to hit any of these goals, regardless of the timetable. To move forward, I follow a framework that was outlined by Mosley and Chen, where they take broad indicators and they take more select ones and group them into these broad categories. And so I chose my categories by looking through the literature to see what fit together, what was appearing in a lot of the data, what has kind of proved as influential in reducing neonatal and infant mortality, and then potentially implementable on a large scale, because it's obvious that mortality does not have one cause, it does not have one solution. And so looking at these broad kind of groups to get at the issue was kind of my goal here. So again, my aim is to follow these category selection to see which category as a whole can reduce infant mortality the most among this vast literature and the vast options that are out there. And then to see if they account for change over time in infant mortality. The categories that the literature led me to, the broad over here, and then the select indicators that comprises them is on the right. And most of them are well known. If you know any of the infant mortality or child mortality literature, it's important where the child is delivered, whether the birth of the child is integrated in the healthcare system. Social determinants is focused on the mother and her education, her age, and where rural or urban status. Reproductive behavior is more as the public health context, the birth spacing, the number of births. It can be more addressed with a public health kind of intervention. And the national context is kind of the idea of either moving forward by increasing the Human Development Index and health expenditures, or by increasing, kind of the way that these are integrated into the healthcare system. Because the money can be allocated, but if it actually gets, to these children and to the health center, that's a pretty big division that could need to be solved. My data comes from the Demographic and Health surveys in 39 countries, and I selected my countries because they had at least 2 surveys. One before 2000 when the goals were implemented, and one after. Majority have multiple surveys though. The data on the national level, due to data restrictions from the DHS, comes from the World Bank, sorry. And if the select year of the DHS survey was not available, I used within 5 years. So there's not very much missing data on the Human Development Index or the health expenditures as percentage of GDP. My outcome measure of infant mortality looks at death or survival by the year or the day of the survey and from the birth date, accounting only for live births. I do not deal with deaths at the birth date. Or preceding birth date, sorry. And then I look at neonatal mortality by interacting the first month of life with the different indicators to determine whether the factor is more influential in that first month or in the following 11. My methods include a discrete time hazard model, which requires a person period data set in order to have multiple records for each case, where I have now 1 record for each month of the child's life. So I can interact with the first month or the following 11. And I look at change over time by looking at the first year of the survey and the last to see whether the variables introduced in their own different models have changed infant mortality from the baseline level.
Could you say a word about the last one?
Oh, so change over time is kind of a small piece because in the end, I guess here's the other spoiler alert, they aren't accounting for change over time in infant mortality. The baseline year level does not change once I introduce all of the different variables. So while infant mortality is reducing, these variables don't seem to be accounting for it. So here is kind of a descriptive show at my different variables. Most are dichotomous variables, whether the child was delivered at a public or private health center versus not, whether the mother received any prenatal care at all or not. You can go through, but the interesting thing here is the correlation with time. And it shows that on average, a lot of these indicators aren't changing. They have a lot of room for improvement. You can see that the health expenditures at bottom and the health center delivering prenatal care have experienced the most change over the time of the surveys. And so you can see where, healthy birth intervals, maternal education, all of these things have a lot of room for growth, which should leave us with hope for the future, right? There's room, to move forward here. So now, this is a log likelihood comparison, which I used to determine which of the 4 groupings had the biggest effect on infant mortality reduction. So from the baseline, you want to see the most reduction in log likelihood. And so here I've listed from the biggest impact on infant mortality reduction to the least. So the social determinants, the mother's age, her urban-rural status, or her education has the biggest impact on infant mortality reduction. Next is the healthcare system, reproductive behavior, and national context. All of them, I'll note, have an influence on infant mortality reduction. However, that's just the order from greatest to least. And I'll now move forward a little bit into some of the individual variables within those broad categories. I've pointed out some things that were of more interest to me here. You can see that maternal education within the social determinants has the greatest impact on infant mortality in the post-neonatal period, with a slightly smaller effect in the neonatal period.
How do you measure maternal education here?
It is from highest completed education, from incomplete primary to primary, incomplete secondary to secondary or higher. And so for every step from incomplete primary to primary, there's a 22% less likely chance for the infant to die. Another thing of note is the prenatal care, and this is just from the mother saying she's had no prenatal care at all, or any prenatal care. Just attending once has a pretty significant impact on the child's life, and even more so in that very first month. There's often a debate between whether maternal education and health healthcare interventions kind of interact, or if they cancel each other out. And so I did an interaction to kind of test whether education strengthens the intervention, so mothers are more able to utilize that, or if the intervention itself can stand alone. So I did an interaction which suggests that if a mother receives prenatal care and increases her education in that one step, so from incomplete primary to primary, there's about a 15% reduction in infant mortality. And so suggesting that prenatal care, the effect of that is magnified by education level. So kind of to conclude and to point out how we should move forward, we have to consider these social determinants of the mother. I mean, I have to say that all of these things, if we had endless time and money, should be a focus, right? They're in the literature for a reason, and people have found their importance. But moving forward, we need a priority, and we need somewhere to focus our efforts, and this suggests that's in maternal education. And it's important to note that maternal education has increased slightly over this period, if even. It remained pretty consistent with time. And so the global monitoring report that came out in 2014 said that education's been slipping down the agenda as new healthcare interventions arise. And so while education still gets pretty good funding, the implementation has been going down. So kind of to close, as we move forward and place funding, we need to keep education at the heart of this agenda. That includes proper quality, because people are getting into schools possibly, but the quality can become quite the inhibitor to actually getting the benefits of it. And I think this should also include health education, because if you noted that prenatal care and healthy birth interval can both be taught in an education setting to teach women, that it's important where they deliver their baby, but also when they get pregnant, their age, all these different things can work in the education system. They don't have to be separate. And so prenatal care and all these health interventions although are very important, they cannot be a substitute for maternal education, and they have to work hand in hand. And so moving forward, we need to keep both as a priority, but we cannot let education drop further off the agenda.
Having a couple soft and hardball questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a number of questions, but I saved some of them for afterwards. So my main, I guess, point here for discussion would be that many of the factors you present, and you mentioned that yourself, that there are different levels on the same chain of causality.
Yes.
So for instance, the level of national economic development is going to influence maternal level of education, which in turn is going to influence reproductive patterns or healthcare. Or
Yes.
So it's a little bit confusing to look at the multivariate results because they're all on the same level.
Okay.
And I'm not sure, you might try to think about more complicated statistical setup.
Okay.
Maybe two-stage, I don't know what's being used, but I think that would add strength.
Okay, sorry. Okay, no, it makes sense. Maybe not by next week. Yeah.
Just a very small thing, when you mentioned the surveys that you have, And then you said that the only criteria you mentioned was that these surveys existed for 2 points in time, but there might be some more. It would be good to say, well, these are also countries that had, some change in mortality, or something substantive of why those are chosen and what's similar about them.
Okay. Yes.
So in your conclusion, we have a fairly strong conclusion that it's education that mattered. I was wondering if you could go back to your results and show us where that conclusion comes from.
Okay. Oh, you mean like right now?
Yeah.
Okay, so.
How do we see what's more important and less important?
Okay, so this, to begin, shows that the social determinants is the most important of the 4 categories.
Is that a set?
Why is that?
What, sorry?
Why is that?
Why is that? So social determinants subtracts farthest from the baseline log likelihood. If you want to see the biggest reduction in log likelihood to see the most impact. Yeah?
Just a question. I was wondering why you chose to compare the log likelihood and not some other measure of likelihood, like AIC or BIC, because log likelihood is driven by, it reduces the more variables you have, and those sort of AIC, BIC control for simplicity of model as well.
Okay.
So it might be interesting to look at those measures.
Yeah, I don't know, I didn't really think about controlling other, it makes sense. Most of them have similar numbers of variables within them. They don't vary too drastically, but that makes sense to look into.
So,
Oh yeah,
I'm
so
sorry,
keep going.
So you're showing us something cross-sectional, is that right? Or is this
Yes.
about explaining the decline?
Well, this is explaining the decline in mortality from whenever in that first survey to the last. So this, looking at log likelihood, has reduced the biggest. But then I take, within that, this is just a section of the larger multivariate.
I guess my point is, you told us in your methodology that you're going to look at how much the period coefficients changed when you added these variables, but then you never showed us that.
Yes,
Okay.
because it's not interesting. Because it doesn't change. The year variable doesn't change throughout. Adding each of these in their own, or adding the combined model where you have all the variables of most significance. So I take this combined model where I take the most influential piece from each model and put it into one, and it stays the same.
Okay, so it seems to me from your presentation of results that you're not telling us the whole story, which is actually very interesting. The whole story is that even though in the cross-section these things appear to be very important, it's not that they're not explaining the change over time. So on the one hand, we have the inference from your cross-sectional evidence that women's education is going to make a huge difference, but on the other hand, we haven't seen that historically.
Right.
And you don't have to resolve that. That is your result.
But education hasn't been changing over this period.
That's fine. So it's a mystery what, it seems clear that further changes in education might have an effect in the future,
Okay.
but
We don't.
that from this regression, but that's not the historical experience. It's still a mystery what the main driver is the last years.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, and it's all in the paper. It's just, yes, I will add that, though. It makes sense.
I think the way you can say it all is by shortening your intro
Okay, fair.
and getting to the analysis, because people will know a lot of what you're saying in
Okay.
the audience. They may need to be reminded of it quickly,
Okay.
but you're not speaking to a group that is not interested in. Isn't this a session about child
It's about
mortality, or is it?
post-millennium development goals, so I think you
It's
guys-
about millennium goals. Okay, so just now.
Okay.
I just wanted to quickly emphasize that I agree with Marley about the
Yeah.
earlier point with the education measure, especially if the bottom line is that education matters. I think I had gotten confused in a previous slide when you showed the average education level that goes
Oh,
between
yeah,
0 and
that's good.
4, which is okay, but since it's a categorical, you just might want to make that a little bit clearer,
Okay.
since it plays an important role here.
Okay.
I would love, so my temptation is to think of years of education, and I don't think that's what you've got.
Yeah, it's.
And we know that there are some non-linear effects education. So going from no education to 4 years of education makes a much bigger difference than going from 1 to 8 years.
Yeah. Okay. It's always hard to tell where the years of education match up with the other. Yeah. It's true.
Well, but from no education to primary only, or maybe you could have like a, different variable, like a set of dummies for no education, primary, secondary, all those things.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you go back to that slide you showed for Josh's question, yeah, it's really impossible for I think someone in the audience to look at that.
That's kind of why I put.
So were you saying what you're picking up on is the biggest change in the log likelihood?
Yes.
So why not show the change rather than the level? And then you can circle it and we can eyeball
Okay,
it
that
and we
makes
can
sense.
see that something is happening. Because right now, even when it's been up here, I still can't tell.
Quick math. Okay.
The other thing, maybe this is too much for this talk and this paper, but it seems one ought to have some idea of the relative cost of these different interventions as well as their effects in order to draw conclusions about what we should be doing.
Yeah.
And education may be vastly, if this were the only reason for it, it might be vastly more expensive than prenatal care or something like that. I don't really know.
Because that's the whole thing, it's not the only benefit. So
Yeah.
that becomes really.
Yeah, and it's just very difficult to know how to
Yeah.
do this.
Okay, well done. So maybe if I could ask both of the poster presenters, since we're not really getting into their actual presentation, the details of it, if they could tell us at the beginning of the talk what kind of feedback would be most useful, so we can try to give you that feedback as opposed to talk about what wasn't clear or.
Okay. So my poster is Stable by Assumption, Uncovering Fluidity in Race and Sex in the American Community Survey. And it's in a poster session on aging, gender, race, and ethnicity, which is on the Thursday afternoon. As for what feedback I'd be interested in, this is part of a longer project, so if you have major concerns about the scope, the focus, that's great. This one in particular will focus a lot on the methodology and the math, so if you have critiques on that, that'd be great as well. So really, just whatever comments you have would be great. So my project really focuses on a core, what I see as a core contradiction. The Census Bureau recognizes that race and ethnicity, and to a lesser extent sex, are social constructs and do not necessarily reflect a true and innate characteristic. But the Census Bureau constructs population estimates that assume that these categories can only be entered through birth and exited through death and distributed by migration. So this project explores the disconnect between the sort of population in theory and the population in statistical practice. So a brief overview of the census methodology. They create these post-census estimates Q through starting by the census population in 2000, adding births, subtracting deaths, and distributing it through net migration. So this is just the same thing for after 2010 census. Between 2000 and 2010, they then have this adjustment factor so that their population estimates are constrained to equal the census estimates in 2000 and 2010, so it's not majorly disconnected. After 2010, because there's no later census, they're sort of unconstrained to the post-census estimates. Once the Census Bureau constructs these post-census estimates, they then use them to weight this American Community Survey as well as other surveys and other statistical products. So you can create statistics that are representative by race, ethnicity, sex, and state and age, such that the population total is equal to the sum of weights for each person in that particular category. So this is the race, ethnicity, age, state, sex, specific population. These are the people in that category, and these are the weights that those individuals are assigned. We can then calculate the annual change in population by subtracting the difference in these weighted estimates across years to sort of back out an estimate of births, deaths, and migration. So what I do is I start from this same sort of population estimates, but I first sum across race, ethnicity, and sex to get a specific population by age, geography, and time. I then create new survey weights that basically are not representative by race, ethnicity, and sex by constraining each person in age, geography, and time. If you multiply them by their weights, then you get the population for that group. Yeah. So I'm then going to divide up this population by the proportions in each race, ethnicity, and sex group that I find in the ACS. So I'm going to say P star T is just that same, these weights, W star, and then just based on what an individual says their race, ethnicity, and sex are, I'm going to then portion them into these populations. There's two major sources of error that I'm concerned with. One is this sampling error. Because I'm basing it on the American Community Survey, that sort of, there's a random chance these proportions will fluctuate over time, purely based on who responds to the American Community Survey and who's selected into the sample. The other concern is systematic overcounts, because I know that the American Community Survey oversamples some populations because they want a larger sample so that they can have more robust statistics. So to account for that, I then adjust my weights, my population estimates, so that I account for the overcount when the ACS overlaps the census. So in 2000, I take the census estimate of a particular subgroup, I divide it by the this estimate that I get from my sort of population estimates from the American Community Survey portions. I do the same in 2010, and then I interpolate them. This also means that, like the Census Bureau methodologies, my estimates are constrained to equal the census counts in both 2000 and 2010. And then I also have this error term from sampling error still hanging out. For years after 2010, I use only the 2010 overcount estimate. Okay, so because my new population estimates they're not proportionally constrained to be representative, that means that I'm not actually following people like the Census Bureau is and counting births, deaths, and migration. So a person can change categories by simply saying that they have a different identity now in the American Community way. So my population estimates can change through births, deaths, and migration, just like census, but there's an additional pathway of categorical change. So now that I have these two estimates and these two components of population change, I then difference my estimates of population change from my weights, from the census weights, so that I get the difference between births, deaths, migration, and categorical change, plus some error, minus births, deaths, and migration. I then cancel through algebra to get out this estimate of net categorical change plus some sampling error. Because there is a sampling error, then make the assumption that categorical change is distributed, where error is a random, mean zero, normal term. So then I use a regression analysis to predict this net categorical change, or at least systematic variation in that, by different categories. So I'm looking to see if there is a systematic over or undercount by the census methodology compared to my methodology for particular race groups, sex groups, and ethnicity groups. And I do that separately for race and ethnicity, by sex, within interaction. So these are the results. On the left is each year's estimate of categorical change. The solid line is for men, the dashed line is for women, so you can think of the difference between those two lines as fluidity from one sex into the other. These are the standard errors, so anything that exceeds those bounds is a significant categorical fluidity in my model. So it does look like there is some significant fluidity happening. On the right,
the scale?
The scale. Negative 400 to 800, so that's...
Those are people.
Those are people. So in a particular age group, in a particular state, in a particular year.
Okay, so it's...
Yeah.
Okay.
So 800 people on average by state, by year, by age are transitioning categories.
So it's like 10,000 nationally, so 200.
I'll get to population estimates in a second, but yeah, it's like that. So this is the cumulative fluidity, which is basically just the cumulative sum of these year shocks. And this is for the black population, by the way.
So is it?
Yeah.
What does plus mean and what does minus mean?
People transitioning into the black category, people transitioning out of the black category. Same for the cumulative. And then the dashed line is specifically transitioning into the black female category, and the solid line is transitioning into the black male category. This is the same graph for Hispanic. So you can see that there is this people transitioning out of Hispanic up until 2006 or so, and then back up to basically no fluidity post. So then, lastly, what I can do with these is I can get the census estimates by population, by categorical groups. I can get my weighted population estimates. I can construct these population estimates. So this is the black population. For men and women, the solid line is the census estimate. The circle points are my population estimates. So you can see that the categorical change has created this undercount, if you believe the sort of categorical change story, and before 2010-ish, and then an overcount, then the census undercounts post 2010. And the same story is true for women. And for Hispanic, you see the census overcounting the Hispanic population through 2006 or 8, and then slightly undercounting it later. The last thing I do is to use these use the difference in these population estimates to count two sets of population statistics that are representative by race, ethnicity, and sex. So I calculate the weighted unemployment rate here, and the solid line is the census methodology estimate, and the circles are my population estimates, and you can see that there's not much change. The right shows the difference between the census and my methodology. You can see that the change is at 0.15 at maximum, so very small changes in unemployment. But if you look at something like the Simpson Diversity Index, which is a measurement of racial and ethnic composition within a particular geographic area, you can see that the census significantly undercounts how much diversity there might be in the US. Yes, before in the intercental years and after. And this on the right is again the difference. So there's at maximum 2.5%, or sorry, 2.5 increase on a scale of 0.33 is the baseline, 5 to 8% change. So fairly large. So in conclusion, I don't mean to argue that the weights that I've produced are necessarily better than the Census Bureau's, but they do make a different set of assumptions. And by comparing these different scenarios with their different assumptions, I can observe some significant fluidity, possibly, in race and ethnicity, and less so in sex. This suggests that population estimates and estimates of diversity could change significantly depending on which sort of population theory you believe. But some statistics may not change noticeably. So it's essentially a call to think a little bit harder about what assumptions we make when we use representative population estimates. Thank you very much.
All right, I will jump right in. Hi everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Leslie Root, and I'm a second year in the Demography program. And I'm going to talk today about geographic differentials in the Russian Mortality Improvement from 2003 to 2012. If you were here last week and you saw Gabriel's presentation, it's very similar. We used a lot of the same techniques, also looking at geographic differences, but different countries. Okay, so the goal of this research is to get at the causes and potential future path of Russia's recent mortality improvement. And to do this, I'm looking at three things: the age pattern, the cause of death pattern, and the regional differences in mortality improvement. Just to preview my conclusions, in case we don't get there, although I think we will. The age pattern is what we would expect from what we know about the mortality crisis, which I'll talk about soon, which is that universally we've seen a large improvement in mortality at adult ages, and especially older working ages, like 35 to 55. And that's true throughout Russia with a little bit of heterogeneity. For the cause of death pattern, we see everywhere cardiovascular mortality has improved a lot, although there's some pretty interesting variation in the ages at which it's improved by region. And the regional differences raise almost as many questions as they answer. Okay, just a little bit about my data and methods. The data source is a Russian source, fertility and mortality database from Moscow. Because the Russian mortality crisis is a story of adult mortality, I'm looking at E20, or expectation of further life at age 20. And I just wanted to do a quick primer on the regional divisions I'm talking about here. So we've got 8 federal districts in Russia. There's 9 now that they took Crimea, but that's not relevant for this time period. Yes, okay. You can kind of think of them in pairs. Over here we have the Southern and North Caucasus federal districts. The North Caucasus especially is fairly poor. They receive a lot of money from Moscow for their state budgets, but they have basically always had the best mortality in Russia, even in the Soviet period, because it's predominantly Muslim and they don't have the same drinking problems that they do elsewhere. The Southern district is often in second place. You can kind of pair the Central and Northwest together. Central Federal District is where Moscow is, and the Northwest is where St. Petersburg is. So these are the most heavily populated. The Volga and Urals are kind of in the middle, and then the low performers out here are Siberia and the Russian Far East. I think I probably have time, so a quick summary of Russian mortality since 1960. Basically, in the late Soviet period, starting under Khrushchev, mortality or life expectancy flatlined for women and started declining for men, contrary to what was happening in the rest of the developed world. This continued until the 1980s. Gorbachev introduced some prohibition-like alcohol reforms and mortality improved everywhere. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you get really bad mortality and just wild swings throughout the 90s until the Putin era, when we've seen this improvement starting in 2003 and continuing until at least early 2015. We're not too sure what's happening right now, but that's what I'm looking at. And I apologize. I have like a lot of great colors on this, and I know that this projector is not very good for them. But this is just to illustrate the mortality situation across Russia and the regional variation we see. So like I said, at the top we have the North Caucasus outperforming everyone. The Southern is in second place. And then what I really wanted to point out with this slide is that this orange line, the Northwest Federal District, so St. Petersburg, and Moscow, to a lesser extent, are really the outliers in this mortality improvement. They've improved a lot more than, well, Moscow somewhat more and St. Petersburg a lot more than any of the other districts. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the age decomposition of mortality improvement. And here's what I was talking about with regional differences. Again, we see the Northwest, St. Petersburg, is an outlier in several ways here. The peak is a little bit earlier. We have this peak in mortality improvement around 50 to 55. It's more like 45 in St. Petersburg. It's a much higher curve overall. They gained a lot. And in general, just at younger ages, they're gaining a lot more in life expectancy. I then also did this as percent contribution, so it all sums to 100, just to show that the North Caucasus is also an outlier in that the curve is shifted to the right. They made a lot more gains in older age mortality, and this is sort of what you would expect because they didn't have that younger adult mortality problem to the same extent that everyone else did. Again, probably because of not as much drinking. Okay. Here we have the causes. I broke everything down into pretty broad causes, and they're sort of broadly ranked here from the most important to the least. And in each column, I've highlighted the district with the highest gain from that cause. Main takeaway here, cardiovascular diseases are the most important source of gain in all of the districts. And especially, again, in the North Caucasus, where this is more like mortality improvements that we're seeing in the West, where it's older people not dying as early from heart disease. Accidents and external causes, very important in most places as well. And this is sort of a drinking-related thing, of course. Homicide and suicide is the third drinking-related cause that is also, fairly important in a lot of these places. I should also mention that these two, there's probably a little bit of heterogeneity in the way these causes are coded. For example, there was recently a discovery that accidental death by drinking has plummeted in the Urals, but it turned out that that's because everybody there, for some reason, started coding it as death by drinking, but we aren't sure whether it's accidental. So that can cause some noise in here. It might even be good to maybe combine these two. One other thing I wanted to comment on here is we have a huge loss in life expectancy from cancer in Siberia, and I don't know why. We'll see it in an upcoming slide that it basically mirrors the improvement from infectious disease, and I think that it could be a lung story that that lung cancer and tuberculosis, there's some weirdness in the coding. I don't really know. It's pretty strange. Okay. Now I want to combine age and cause decomposition. Again, we're just showing that the Northwest is an outlier here. This is the gain from cardiovascular disease over different ages, and we see, wow, the gains are spread over younger ages in the Northwest, and there's overall more gains. Now, this is partly because a lot of previous scholarship has shown that, at least in the Russian Federation, alcohol consumption and cardiovascular death are very highly correlated. So that gives some evidence that in the Northwest, a lot of this cardiovascular improvement might actually be an alcohol improvement. Looking at accidents and external causes, we see maybe the same thing with the Northwest having a smoother and higher curve than anywhere else. Everything else is a bit more noisy, partly because these are smaller causes of death than cardiovascular disease. And again, we see that the Caucasus and the Southern Federal District are at the bottom of this because they don't have these problems to the same extent. Okay. Finally, I wanted to show what the decompositions look like within each district. So this is by age, by cause, by district. And we can see some similarities and some differences here. Everybody's got this sort of high, somewhat later peak for cardiovascular, and an earlier, smaller peak for accidents. But here in the Far East, things haven't improved quite as much, right? In the South, a lot more of the improvement is from cardiovascular. And then I put Siberia on here to illustrate how weird it is. And how we've got, again, apologies for the colors, but this is the infectious diseases, lots of gain from that, and lots of loss from neoplasms. Which again, it could be a long story. The neoplasm thing could be differences in smoking rates, or I suggested this, but I'm not sure if it's actually responsible to do so, that men in Siberia could have worked in more cancer-causing industries than in other parts of Russia. You have Norilsk with nickel mining and all these factory towns that are doing dangerous things. Possible, but it seems like that wouldn't really account for the whole thing, in my opinion. Okay, so we made it. To go over my conclusions again, this provides more data in support of the cardiovascular revolution starting in Russia. Unfortunately, the cardiovascular revolution can be caused by healthier lifestyles or better medical care, or both. So it's kind of hard to tell what's going on. I think the fact that the slope of the improvement is similar everywhere indicates that it might be a medical intervention. Access to medical care and quality of medical care is actually quite similar across most of Russia. It's a little bit worse for rural people, but the vast majority of Russia is urban, so even in Siberia. We obviously still have lingering alcohol problems, although maybe not in the Northwest. Maybe they've just made a lot more gains from alcohol. That's part of my hypothesis, because in the Northwest, a large majority of the population lives in a small area around St. Petersburg, Leningrad Oblast. So it's possible that some kind of local intervention or change in drinking culture could have just really fixed that for a lot of people. Maybe kind of sexier explanation is that Those cohorts who were dying in St. Petersburg in 2003, I mean, those were babies of World War II. Leningrad obviously was pretty hard hit by that with the 900-day siege and all, so it could be kind of a cohort frailty thing, but I don't know. Russianists really like it when I suggest that, but I'm not sure demographers would. So I'd really like to dig deeper into what's going on in the Northwest, and talking about what's next for Russia, especially given the economic downturn under Putin. Thanks.
We now have lots of time.
Do you have, is migration dealt with in this at all? Do you have confidence that the deaths are attributed to where people lived? Or did people just move to Siberia to have cancer?
No, I don't. That is a really good point. I don't have data on migration. Russians do not tend to move around as much as Americans, so it's probably not causing that much noise, especially migration into Siberia and the Far East is not really something that's happening. If anything, it would, people are moving into Moscow, so.
This is only 2003, right? You're only looking at 2003, 2012.
Yeah.
Because there was migration into Siberia in earlier periods.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I would suggest just the way you present it because what, is it the whole session on Russia or is it?
No, it's, the poster session is just on
Oh,
mortality.
it's poster.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah,
it's
so-
not that important, I forgot that, but I think when you present it only, it would be good to start with stating that, that there's been this crisis in Russia and it's mostly affected older adults and cardiovascular disease. So what you say afterwards can be interpreted in that context.
Okay.
And I also remind me to put you in touch with a Russian student who's doing her dissertation on specifically this topic, but for a longer time period.
Oh, is she the one who's
Ina Danilova?
normalizing the data?
Yeah,
So
she's in that, yeah.
Yeah, I would love to talk to her.
Okay.
Yes?
Well, two small things. One is, my gut feeling is that Siberian data is bad. And you're gonna get questions along that line, you might wanna think of how you answer those. It's just so far out of line with other things you show. It really gives you the impression that the feeling that it's somehow not a good registration.
Yeah.
The other thing is, just from a practical standpoint, you've got, in my opinion, you've got way too much going on in your graphs, and it's very difficult for people to follow. And I suggest you might want to think of some ways of simplifying presentation. For example, the number of age groups you use, which make very nice curves, may not be necessary for what you actually want to show. You want to show why the Caucasus is different, and you want to, and perhaps reducing the number of age groups would help simplify the presentation. Another possibility would be to show deviation with respect to a line which would be given by all of Russia. I don't know, but it's just very difficult to follow, and those colors, they're just very difficult to follow. And actually, most of the results you actually don't even comment on. You comment on the ones that are above, the ones that are below. You might think of ways of simplifying the presentation.
Okay.
So does Putin deserve credit for what's going on with this, or is most of what, and if so, what did he do? And if not, is it because we're seeing mortality that's actually influenced by the previous decades? What's your thought?
That's a great question. Nobody wants to give Putin credit for it. Certainly nobody in the West. I presented this at a Russian Studies conference and nobody liked it. Because the person before me presented on how bad alcoholism is and the person before her presented on how bad smoking is. But the reality is that in 2006, the Putin administration introduced a bunch of health reforms which really increased access to primary care. There's not a lot of good data on how that actually affected things, but probably it did. Unfortunately, primary care doctors took a huge budget cut last year, so that's kind of gone away now. Also in 2006, there was a major reform cracking down on bootleg liquor, which greatly increased the price of vodka and seemed to have a negative effect at first, and then things got better. But also there's cultural change. Russians of my generation tend to be more moved towards drinking beer rather than hard liquor, which is much, much better for you. So, and Putin didn't do that. Yes.
And to add to
So
that,
therefore-
I would say that compared to all other Eastern European countries which went through the same crisis, Russia is actually the last one to sort of see a turnaround of trends. So it's much more negative than just looking at Russia. Everywhere else, they've made improvements starting about, well, nearly, not in Ukraine, but 10 years ago. And some of these countries have nearly caught up, like, Eastern Europe.
I'm just thinking about forecasting the Trump effect in the US. And
Do you have time for one more, or you talk after? Well, I love the focus in cardiovascular disease, and when you talked about common access to care across a very large geographic region, okay, it could, but I think what we know from the stuff in the United States, and we do have a different system here, but, good cardiovascular care does depend on who your doctor is, and so if you're at a teaching hospital, you're more likely to get the sort of most current stuff. So I think that was a very interesting part of this, and if you're giving a talk to a cardiovascular surgeons or something, they might say, well, actually, maybe we think there is some geographic variation. And I think there's some knowledge about what it looks like in the US anyway.
Great.
all right, thank you all three. Next year would be only presentations from demography.